Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome from here in London. I'm delighted today to be introducing an excellent session on a panel, really, which is going to be talking about how to develop an ecosystem for FinTechs to thrive. Now, you'll know me. I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it's very much my privilege to be able to introduce these webinars. I'm only able to do so, though, because we have a very, very tolerant and interesting group of sponsors who allow us to range widely and freely across anything to do with technology, economics, and finance. And in fact, we have as one of our big sponsors here today, Invest Northern Ireland. And we'll be hearing much more about that later as we touch on Northern Ireland and Belfast and the FinTech cluster there. The agenda today is fairly straightforward. I've got a few more remarks to make, but my job is to get out of the way and let you hear from our experts today, Ian Laverty, John O'Hara, and Kirk Wiley, and we'll be going into discussion with them. And I would encourage you to use the GoToWebinar question facility. Please send the questions in. I'll feed them into the conversation. Please don't email me because I'm here with you now, and I'll only get those questions afterwards. I would like, though, to make a few remarks ourselves. I mean, as many of you will know, Zien runs a number of indices, including the Smart Centers Index. We also have, of course, within our Global Financial Centers Index, a deep dive into FinTech. And one of the things that is noticeable in the FinTech arena has been very much the fact that the Chinese centers have been storming ahead. And I think so, doing so for good reason. Quite a bit of Western FinTech is really putting a phone app on front of an antiquated system. I know our panel will have some thoughts on that, and we'll come on to that. Second thing I might like to point out is that the FinTech area in Britain has picked up noticeably. There is an argument that the UK government, in fact, coined the term FinTech about 7 or 8 years ago when it wanted to sort of lay claim to having developed a cluster of firms around Old Street in the city of London, the so-called Silicon Roundabout. That said, it is a real and material sector in the UK and one that's rising, and we'll be hearing a lot more about the details of that when we have Charlotte Crosswell on later this year from Innovate Finance. However, the session today is focused on the ecosystem elements. How do you actually build something that thrives? Whilst we will be covering it, one of the things I might point out to people is that the FinTech area, in terms of employment, ranges around the 70 to 80 to 90,000 mark. It is a bit precise, but something like 42% of the workers in that sector are actually non-UK nationals, and also something like 49% of the FinTech businesses are actually owned by non-UK nationals. So it's an interesting area. The other thing that we have some difficulties with is foreign direct investment. So a lot of the top 10 FinTech deals within EMEA frequently in the statistics turn up a little confusingly, both in the UK statistics and also in some of the EMEA statistics. And the UK has often been a springboard into other FinTech centers such as Berlin or Amsterdam. So the numbers are a bit dodgy. Lately, we've seen an enormous drop in foreign direct investment in the UK. It's pretty much halved in the last 2 years. And I think our panel will have some views on that as well. So it's going to be an interesting and rich area. But just before we begin, the panel wanted to have a poll. And so I'm just going to launch a poll. So that's kind of fingers on buzzers for all of you out there. And the question really is, what do you represent? So let me just launch this poll. Where are you coming from? Are you a FinTech, a financial institution, or neither? Just waiting a few more seconds for polling. We are now up past the 3/4 mark and just about to close the poll. Great. Okay. And to share the results. So for the panelists, as you can see, some FinTechs, some financial institutions, not that many, and a lot of people are just interested in the subject area. So that's great. Anyway, just to get things moving, I'd like to hand over now, exactly on time, to Ian Laverty, who's going to give us an impression really from what it's like up in Northern Ireland. Ian, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Michael. Morning, everyone. As Mike said, my name is Ian Laverty. I head up the inward investment team for the financial services sector for Invest Northern Ireland across GB and most of Europe. So Invest Northern Ireland is what you would describe as a regional development agency. It sits within the Department for the Economy within Northern Ireland Government. And we've got a number of remits, two main remits, however. The first is to encourage and to support the growth of businesses that are located within the Northern Ireland region. And our second remit, and the team that I head up, encourages organisations from across GB, across Europe, to look at Northern Ireland as a potential expansion opportunity. So why would an organisation do that rather than just expand where they are or anywhere else for that matter? Well, firstly, expanding into Northern Ireland brings you into our FinTech cluster, our FinTech ecosystem, and we'll talk more about that over the rest of the morning. It gives you access to some of the best educated and most talented professionals at significantly lower costs than many other cities and regions across Europe, and particularly London and the southeast of England. And secondly, as an organisation, Invest Northern Ireland supports organisations looking at Northern Ireland through a number of different interventions. And some of those are financial assistance interventions, such as grants towards salary costs, grants towards research and development, grants towards training and development, as well as a range of soft support mechanisms, such as site and location support, help you find the right location with our in-house property team, and support towards recruitment, understanding that if you've not recruited in Northern Ireland before, it might be unfamiliar to you. So our relationship with the universities and with recruitment agencies can support you there as well. In fact, our work with the universities, along with the business communities, professional bodies, the business groups, and other government departments, has led to this thriving FinTech ecosystem in Northern Ireland. And as we go through the next 45 minutes, I'll be delighted to give you a bit of an insight into how we've achieved that. And before I hand back to Michael, and Michael's shown a number of statistics there, I'll leave you with one of my own. In 2019, the city of Belfast within Northern Ireland was ranked as the #1 location globally for FinTech investment projects. And that was a ranking by FDI Markets, part of the Financial Times Group. So if that statistic is a surprise to you, that suggests there's still a level of unfamiliarity with what's going on within FinTech within the UK. But again, I'll be delighted to give you an insight into how we've achieved that over the next 45 minutes or so. Back to you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And John, the floor is now yours.
Let the technology work. There you go. The wheels spin into motion. Thank you very much, Michael. I'm John O'Hara. I'm CEO and co-founder of TaskGuys. TaskGuys is a platform that lets you solve people problems between financial services firms. You can think of it as STP, straight-through processing for people. Why that's interesting is 60% of costs in banking operations are in people. And whilst everyone tries very hard to automate, we're the one that's looking at making those people more efficient whenever the automation fails. Coming to today's session is really interesting for me because I think it's a very authentic session to look at people's experience with from a FinTech point of view and from a financial services point of view, and to hear also from the government representation and how they see it. Myself, I spent 20 years working for large tier 1 banks before I started the FinTech. So I've traveled the journey from a large banking environment into a very different environment starting a startup. So that's my perspective on this, and I look forward to talking with the panel about it today. Thank you. I'll hand over to Kirk.
Oh, gosh. And yes, Kirk, over to you then.
Yeah, Hi, I'm Kirk Wiley. I've been pretty active in the FinTech community in the UK, both as the founder of Open Gamma, a relatively prominent FinTech startup here in London. Since then, I've moved on to large financial services institutions, including State Street and NatWest, where I've also been an advisor to a number of incubators around the FinTech ecosystem. I have two caveats that I've been told to give. The first is if at various points I seem slightly fatigued, it's because I have an active case of COVID-19. So I'm over the hump, but I just wanted to let people know, no, you cannot catch it through the microphone. The second caveat is that although I am employed by NatWest Group, I am not appearing on behalf of NatWest Group. My opinions are those of my own, and I cannot speak around NatWest's involvement in the FinTech ecosystem or anything that NatWest is doing. So those are my official get out of jail free cards, which allows me to then be as opinionated as I typically am on panels.
Excellent. Well, we certainly like opinionated panelists. So I'm just going to launch now a second poll for the panelists. And this one is audience opinions. What do you think is the likelihood of FinTech disrupting the technology landscape? Anything from complete transformation and to they haven't really done anything and probably won't do anything much. Votes coming in. Great, folks. Fast crowd here. We're just over the 60% mark. Give it just a couple more seconds. Okay, at the 3/4 mark. And over that now. So I'm just going to close that poll and share it with everyone. And as you can see, they will improve the landscape or the ecosystem, but the overall landscape will remain similar. Seems to be the dominant theme here. So if I could ask all of the panelists to put their cameras on, let's get cracking with the discussion. Folks, while you send in your comments, questions, and observations, we obviously had a few here. One of the things that bothers me is, FinTech. I came into the City of London in 1984 to put computers into finance. And, it's long been said that we're a digital area anyway. So what's the role of FinTech in the financial ecosystem? Ian, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, no, I'll kick that off. So before I ever got into civil service and working for local government, I was in banking, so worked for Lloyds Banking Group and Scottish Widows from the millennium right up to 2010, give or take. So about 10, 11 years there. And one of the things that I noticed was how slow the big financial services institutions are. And that's not generally. And I think the role of FinTechs has become the role of the innovator in the financial services sector. If you go back 10 years ago, the big financial services firms were some of the last to develop things like mobile web and mobile apps, which were just becoming the norm there. If you fast forward to today, actually financial services is one of the leading sectors when it comes to the development of technology, whether that's AI, machine learning, whether it's the data sciences, whether it's cybersecurity, online payments, regtech, insurtech, etc. The acceleration's been huge, but that is all down to the FinTechs and the entrepreneurialism and the good startups that we've seen over the last 10 years. So I think within the financial services sector, FinTechs have to be the hub of innovation.
Kirk, you're our kind of resident COVID expert at the moment. Don't want to pick on you too much, but we're going to have to touch on COVID, so I'd like to get it out of the way.
Fair enough.
The financial services industry is seen as having been hurt less by the pandemic. In fact, some figures indicate it may be surging. Actually, is this true though of FinTech as a subsector?
I'm not entirely sure whether this is good for FinTechs or whether it's not good for FinTechs. And I think if you take a look at the kind of larger financial services firms, a lot of the performance that we've seen over the course of the last few quarters has been driven by very high levels of market volatility. So most of the big firms have investment banking returns that are, that are 2 quarters in a row of once in a decade performance, especially over the course of the last decade. But that's mostly because retail and commercial defaults are a trailing indicator. So we had very, very high levels of market volatility at the start. We haven't seen companies fully default on loans as of yet. And so, having the provisions on the balance sheet for those eventual ones just haven't hit as of yet. What I would say is that where there is FinTechs that are collaborating with large firms, it's been a really mixed bag. And it's been a really mixed bag because at the moment, everybody being at home makes this a high friction environment in which to do new collaboration, right? You can't just go and meet somebody in a coffee shop. They're all closed. You can't do meetings and do whiteboards. And, a lot of firms have technology platforms that are really designed to minimize digital loss and minimize accidental contact with outside firms, which makes it a really high friction way to interact. So any firms that are based on, in-person collaboration, that are based on kind of getting their foot in the door as a direct finance initiative, as opposed to a cost savings or technology play, are very tough. That being said, one of the things that I think all the larger firms are looking to do is understand that after 2020, there's going to be real cost pressures, right? So profits, we anticipate that banking profits will be down. It just hasn't hit yet. So anywhere that you're offering in efficiency play is going to be a really active area of larger firms trying to work with FinTechs.
John, on that theme of working together or competing, you're in the midst of it really with the way that task size is working. I mean, do you see FinTech as competitors? Is that the way that we should view it? Or is it more that it's always going to be allies?
I think it's a really interesting time, a shaking out time. I know we sort of missed some of the slides you're showing here, but I thought it was interesting to sort of look at the landscape and then say where we are and what we think is happening. So you see the landscape of the legacy companies becoming technology aware and moving their heft, copying the digital innovators. You see the digital innovators moving in, essentially trying just to become new banks, coming in from the bottom with brand new platforms and trying to take that market share. But they're so far behind, they have none of the historical heft and momentum of a large organization. Then you see the technology players who are adding pure technology into the mix, or perhaps the threat of an Amazon or Google coming into the mix, which hasn't happened yet. But there's been the occasional overture, like with Facebook making the odd noise of a few years ago. Then there's the fact the landscape is very large. This is a very large landscape. FinTech's grown to incorporate RegTech and InsurTech as well in its definition. And you have essentially two broad churches, one where you're going to sell new financial products and one where you're helping the incumbents. And my company task is in the help the incumbents camp. Kirk said that, if you're selling technology to these firms to help them, that's where we are. And selling efficiency plays is where we are. So I think as a time of the great shakeout, I saw in your PowerPoint here that FinTech's been around for 10 years. I can't believe it's 10 years now. And now is the time of reckoning. The financing's drying up in a few places. Investors are looking for the payback. When you're working with companies like where Kirk's involved, we've seen the deal velocity drop by 30%. Just everyone's slowing down. And we've seen also that people say, oh, we're seizing these new technologies and look how well we're working from home. But actually what we see is what's really happening is people are committing to paths that already started. They're not really opening new paths. And there, if you're past that line where you're in a conversation and you can finish that, it will happen. But you're going to be really tested on the cost benefit of what you're doing. Again, to what Kirk said about banks looking forward and knowing what's coming, they're really examining the cost benefit of what you're offering and looking. They're not looking at the hype; they're looking at the actual return. For FinTech, this is a very tough environment to operate in because the cost of sales to the banks is extremely high. Just enduring the process is famously hard. And I think that's not getting any easier. People aren't making it easier, and rightly so. FinTech shouldn't expect to get an easy ride. So I think now's a tough time. It'll be very interesting. I think volatility will define the next 12 months, and that's a volatility in the experience of what FinTechs perceive as this happens. That's my view. But Kirk, what's your view?
I think it's absolutely a volatile time. I think it's it will be a tough next 12 months to come out with something that is totally new. It's a totally new offering, especially one that has a retail focus. I think everybody is trying to double down and really, and this is, across households where people are saying, okay, what is the state of my finances? How am I going to defend myself? What if I lose my job as a result of COVID? As well as companies, right? There are some new things that are going to be launched by the large financial services, but it's going to be, incremental on what they have today and optimized for a lower touch environment. So much more investment in their mobile platforms, much more investment in internet platforms, because nobody wants to go to a branch, and nobody wants to go to a branch, and branch brokers don't want to be there themselves that much. I think the more secular trends, though, one of the ones that I think is really interesting is cash is dead. And that's going to be and I think that's going to be secular across definitely Europe as a whole, and it's going to really bring us into a world that's going to look a lot more like China, where, I've been to Guangzhou. If you actually want to buy something with a bill, people look at you like you've come from Mars, right? So I think you're seeing some of these things, but yeah, volatility and buckling down on existing offerings with just new improvements for the new ways of working. I think those are going to be some of the trends that we're seeing.
Ian, you wanted to kick in.
No, I did. Thanks, Michael. Just on the question you asked and developing the point that John was making around FinTechs and whether they're allies or competitors of the traditional financial services institutions. If we go back to the title of the session around developing an ecosystem, I think the large financial services companies recognize that FinTechs are allies, and you mentioned about the threat of competition from your Googles and Amazons and things like that, and maybe FinTechs working with financial services companies are the way that they protect themselves. If you look at how it works in an ecosystem where you have the large companies working with the small and innovative companies like the FinTechs, working with government, working with academia, a great example of that is where the large financial institutions are funding accelerators and incubators, some of them part funded by government, some of them working in collaboration with universities, all of them trying to develop new ideas in the fintech space. And if you look at some of the things that we've launched in Northern Ireland, Ulster University recently launched its higher-level apprentices in financial technology, or FinTech, and that was developed with some of the large financial services institutions like Allstate, Laverty, Danske Bank, who operate in the region here. And indeed, the Ulster University also have a degree in FinTech, an honours degree in FinTech, developed with the private sector. The reality is that the majority of the graduates that go through programs like that developed in conjunction with those large corporate partners, the majority of the graduates will actually end up working in the SME fintech population. So it is the large corporates that are developing that on behalf of the ecosystem for that talent to then go into that fintech population, if you like. It always brings me back to a conversation I had last year with a big brand name, won't mention them, who invest in these incubators and accelerators, and they said, when we find a fintech that's interesting, we'll invest in it. When interesting becomes useful, we'll acquire it, which is an interesting approach. And I think that's an approach that quite a lot of the financial services institutions take. But if it's going to be a successful ecosystem, the fintechs need to be able to supply to the large corporates. They've got to have their own processes and procedures in place. They've got to have the talent there. And the large financial service companies recognize that. So they actually invest quite heavily in that ecosystem, I would suggest.
I'd like to come back to that because there's some questions here related to that. But just before we do so, Vladimir Dimitrov makes a good point. He's saying fintech is a very broad term. Can the panelists distinguish between technology providers to financial institutions and technology-enabled providers of financial services? The first group, the technology providers, may be enabling the second group of new technology-enabled financial services. What do you think about that? Every sector wants to claim it's big, so are we kind of trying to embrace too much?
I think so. So I've been uncomfortable with fintech as a term encompassing everything that touches a combination of, it's almost become shorthand for, you're not a large financial services firm, you're small and funded via VC or friends and family, private equity or something like that, and you touch finance in some way, right? But when you take a look at you've got everything from challenger banks like that are trying to be direct competitors to the large traditional financial services institutions, to firms like OpenGamma and TaskEyes that are directly there to enable financial services firms and everywhere in between. And I think taking a look at it and saying they are relatively small firms that do something with technology somewhere around finance. It's guaranteed to give you massive numbers, but it makes it really difficult to differentiate between individual things, all the way out to, and there's a lot of firms that come in and they say, actually, we're going to take a look at what a large financial services firm does that they do badly, and we're going to solve for that exact thing, right? Like that was the original point of TransferWise. It was the original point of Monzo. There have been a bunch of firms that come in and they say this thing, and it's really interesting to me that banks still haven't dropped their FX transaction rates, even though most banks have seen volumes shoot through the floor, because everybody's like, why would I use this platform that's charging me this massive spread? But their internal product teams find it really difficult to self-cannibalize.
Yeah.
And some firms are looking to be acquired. I mean, it's the startup model, FinTechs. Either IPO or you look for a sale. So if you follow that model of looking for a niche, a gap, and then innovating there and improving it, you're hoping one of these large firms will contemplate buying you. I think Ian's observation from his anonymous friend is a very good one. That idea of invest to experiment and then acquire when it works. But that acquisition bar, then when it works, that the level of conservatism there is extremely high. And I think it means that the organizations, the VCs backing these things, that the capital is very much at risk for a long time until the thing's completely proven. So I agree with what Kirk's saying completely. I've certainly experienced that across the gamut. One other thing is, whenever organizations are entering just to compete, become other financial service providers to retail, for example, what you see, and I think, Michael, you hinted at this, is you're kind of putting something shiny in front of a dinosaur. But that works. You see a lot of these, I won't mention names, but small, sexy firms with great retail offerings and beautiful apps on mobile phones, and they're underpinned by the traditional custodians, the traditional banks, the traditional mainframes. And indeed, that's the only way to come to market fast enough. And if you look at them, they're just charging a slightly higher spread on the product. So they have to do their marketing very well.
Yeah, it's a tough spot. I mean, I've certainly seen reports when I actually dig into them. I find WorldPay, for example, is a fintech. I mean, WorldPay's in the 1990s, and I'm not saying it's not doing good things. I just mean, if this is your definition, then it's just about anything that's been created in the last 30 years, which doesn't get us very far. So thank you very much for that, Vladimir. A couple of points here, actually, that I think touch on something I'd like to cover. Here in the UK, and I think it's important to remember my opening slide there showing the rate of China. I see genuine fintech in China. What I tend to see here is basically add-ons, Me Too, things that are getting over our idiotic anti-money laundering approaches in the first place, which is sort of you're hobbled. Now, Donald McRae is saying, our fintechs, the R&D development departments or units of the big players. Jeremy Light saying, in my experience, banks tend to treat fintechs like suppliers rather than partners. This is an ingrained behavior in banks. What could they do to change it? Banks are notoriously bad partners. And I think sometimes we forget in the United Kingdom that we're talking about 5 players controlling 85% of the retail sector, and not much more than that in the insurance sector, which is also part of fintech. So, we've got big cartels, yet when we look abroad, we see a lot more innovation and less cartelized behavior. How much are we being insular here? And what are the banks really doing except just letting some investors fund startups? And if it suits them, they might take it over.
Massively. And we see this, and you also see the geopolitical aspect of it as well. There's ecosystems in Europe, ecosystems in North America, ecosystems in different parts of the world, and they do want to have their cake and eat it. I think banks complain about how difficult it is to do business, how old some of our approaches are, but they haven't yet made the transition to what, say, the automotive or electronics supply chains have done and become much better at co-opetition. Banks, I think, and financial services in general need to get better at sharing, and they recognize this and they say it a lot. There's a fundamental fear. I think fear is a very strong driver in these things. That because digital technology moves very fast, finance can follow it very quickly. I think there's a worry that if they open the gate or create an innovation or share a technology, that someone else will capitalize on that better than they have, and they may lose their position, the position they have. So I think that no one talks about this very much. It's in the background. I very strongly believe from my entire career experience in this, which then makes it difficult to have a playing field for innovation. If we could have the banks innovate like Silicon Valley do, where the big companies spin out small companies, they're really aggressive about it. There is co-opetition, there's genuine partnership, and a genuine ecosystem. These small companies can become successful and large, and the technology gets shared widely, like Zoom and the like. We'd be in an entirely different place. But I feel, and I'd love to know from this esteemed panel, if you agree that there are forces not talked about very much that prevent some of these transformations.
Yeah. Banks are, by their very nature, very risk averse. And to a certain extent, having been inside one and been in the senior management echelons of one of the largest retail banks, you can understand that. As soon as the bank does something wrong, it gets an absolute kicking all over the place. And I always think it's a media favorite to give financial services a kicking where it can, and banks and insurance companies in particular. That question of whether they are suppliers or whether they're partners, I think one of the drivers for that is if you are in partnership with somebody and it goes pear-shaped, you are partially culpable for that. If you keep a fintech at arm's length as a supplier and it goes pear-shaped, it's the supplier's problem. So I think the relationship that the industry has with the media actually is one of the driving forces for that. I think because it is an industry that does get a kicking so quickly, I think that means that it keeps some of that I guess supply at arm's length, if you like. When you consider how, and Kirk's better placed than me, I think, for this, but when you consider how decisions are made in banks with the number of committees and budget sign off and things like that, just to get any kind of innovation wheel turning, for the risk of it not working and then having to explain the budget that you've spent on it, it means that banks, senior managers and banks, will always have a natural aversion to developing their own in-house.
Well, great. Now, in the time available, we wanted to touch on government. And so there's a poll here, folks, as well for you, because I think, government is a fundamental part of this ecosystem, and it certainly wants to claim credit for it. So let's see what the audience feels about that. If you look at poll, the government should do whatever it takes to stop FinTechs relocating. Tax breaks should be retained. They don't deserve any special treatment. Give you just a few more seconds. Get us up closer to the 75% mark. Fantastic. Good. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. And there you go. Interesting spread. We can see here the government tax break should be retained for FinTechs. Interesting. It seems to be the most predominant one. Anyway, back to the panel. Along this line, Paul Dooley is curious, are central banks the catalyst to FinTech success? And to answer that question, I think we might want to look abroad a little bit. Any thoughts?
So, yes. And I think regulatory forbearance, fast path to regulatory approval, even regulatory blockers on existing firms forming cartels is really important for FinTech. So, at previous firm, we said, look, the biggest threat that we face existentially is one of the regional regulators putting a section order on us, blocking us taking on new business, giving a fast path regulatory approval to a new entrant that is coming out of Amazon or Google or Facebook and is building things absolutely from scratch. It's an absolute existential threat to the firm. So I think there's a lot that central banks can do by supporting firms, by supporting fintechs through the regulatory approval process, where they don't have an army of 20 people that do nothing but deal with the central banks every day and all the regulators, and potentially putting blockers on firms from going in and engaging in anti-competitive behavior.
Now, Bob McDowell's curious here, again on the government line, and it's interesting given that there's a bill going through Parliament now looking at restricting mergers and acquisitions in 17 sensitive areas, where mergers and acquisitions of fintech companies pose a potential disruption to operational financial stability. Should they be subject to government and regulatory review, is what he's curious about.
So personally, as someone that founded a VC-backed startup, I think blocking, it depends on what you're looking at from a if you're looking at it from a concentration risk perspective. Yes, if you're saying in these areas you shouldn't be allowed to do M&A, you will kill the fintech ecosystem, right? The most common exit path for any tech. So, okay, having worked with a lot of VCs over the years, I've done a lot of, I've founded 2 VC-backed startups. The 3 most likely exits for any startup are, first of all, it just fails, you liquidate, and you go out of business. That is the most common outcome. Second most common outcome is you're acquired, very often by a competitor, and the absolute, home run outcome is you IPO. But it's very much the rarest one. And if you block off that M&A route, then you block any reason for investment into small firms, and you completely kill the environment.
I completely agree. There's such a high-risk endeavor starting a startup that you need as many home run opportunities as possible. In fact, regulatory stability, we're seeing some challenges in entrepreneurs relief, for example, in the UK, and it seems like a very mild tax break. But whenever you're stacking up beans as to why you should start one of these things, you want to know what's going to be there at the end. And I think regulatory stability, the ability to trust that the government has said and that it will last, is much more important for these environments. And it's something that the UK has been very good at in the past, though I'm slightly worried that perhaps it's less good at it going forwards. Stability is absolutely key, and I completely agree with what Kirk just said. There has to be a clear view that a way of exiting exists in order for your inventors and entrepreneurs to even start this journey.
Yeah. But actually, on the regulatory stability, by the way, one area that the UK has been terrible at, and it has really blocked innovation, is in pension and investment fund rules. Every year, every single year, the Chancellor messes with the rules in some way to move some level, and it means that there isn't enough stability that people launch products. It's been very rare to have innovation coming into that investment area because every year the pension rules change, every year the ISA rules change. There is no stability. There's no way that you can look at it and say, oh, actually, this is going to be stable enough for me to be willing to launch something, as opposed to in the US, where they've held the rules pretty much exactly the same for decades. The amount of retirement savings, the amount of investment bites, and the amount of innovation in the fintech ecosystem in the States is well above and beyond, because people know what the rules are. People know what the playing field looks like. It isn't subject to the Chancellor waking up on budget day and saying, I'm going to drop the pension threshold again to zero. No pension investment anymore.
Yeah. It is difficult to explain to foreigners that we actually have no idea what's in that red box on the morning. It's pretty scary, actually, on a whole variety of fronts. And I might also point out, folks, that America does have 5,000 banks, whereas in Britain there are about 100 deposit-taking institutions. So I'm not surprised to see more competition there. But Ian, you're actually in the role of kind of selling all this to people, and you've clearly been very successful at it. I noted that in the last 2 years, FDI in total has dropped. And on the warm-up call, we were talking about a number of things. So when you're selling to people, the concept of coming to Britain is, and especially into Belfast and Northern Ireland, what are the things that they raise? We were talking Brexit. Are we talking visas? Are they looking for really just give me some skilled staff? What's driving them in there, and how do you get over some of these obstacles of a capricious government?
Sure. So, I mean, the easy answer there, Michael, is it depends, but let me try and qualify that slightly. It depends on where the company is currently located in terms of what their major issues are. So across Europe, there's no doubt at all that Brexit is the biggest subject, and Northern Ireland being a potential centre inside the UK, giving access to the UK market, is attractive. The reality is that until we know what the rules are, it's difficult for anybody to make any decisions there. Actually, what we find is a lot of the investment that comes into Northern Ireland comes from GB, in particular the southeast of England, but also from the States as well, east and west coast of the United States. Two main reasons for that. One is the cluster of companies and the availability of skills and talented professionals that we've got there. So again, back to the theme of ecosystem, where our ecosystem has really worked and why it's become attractive to inward investment is Invest Northern Ireland as an organisation works very closely with the private sector, with businesses, and also with the universities. And what that means is we've got universities who are shaping their programs so that they're creating graduates where ourselves, Invest Northern Ireland, are creating jobs, if you like. And that means that organisations looking at Northern Ireland, they have the confidence that they're going to find the skills that they want, coupled with the fact that Northern Ireland as a region is a lower cost region than most regions in Europe, and certainly the southeast of England. So typically salaries or property costs would be 30-35% lower than the likes of London or Dublin, etc., and most other European capital cities. So you get that brilliant combination of available talent, educated to a high level, the availability of it, and lower cost. It makes it an attractive proposition, if you like. And because it has that very strong cluster and has a very strong reputation, companies have the confidence that they're going to find both graduate level and middle and senior management staff that they're looking for.
So I actually led an investment into Northern Ireland at State Street. So we opened an engineering center. It was very, very simple calculus because we needed a new engineering center. We had London, we had Dublin, we had offices throughout Europe. We were looking for a new one. And it really, for us, came down to talent, cost, regulatory stability, because it was in the UK. We didn't have to open up anything. We didn't have to deal with BaFin, which we didn't want to, and proximity. So the fact that it was a 45-minute flight from London City to Belfast City, that literally I could be in the office 2 hours after leaving the office in London, that was a big deal for us.
We've got time for just a few quick responses to some questions. This year, everything is about working from home and COVID. Last year, everything was about Brexit and the other B, blockchain. So Samarit Rubin is asking, distributed ledger technology, why doesn't it fly yet? What does the panel think?
So I've always been a proponent of permissioned blockchains to solve very particular items, and I think we're going to see it where I especially think eventually securities clearing will end up on distributed ledgers. There's no reason for it not to. Do I think cryptocurrencies are going to be anything other than a speculatory niche? No, and quite frankly, I wish they hadn't have been invented just because of the carbon implications.
Okay. Elizabeth Steele is curious, for those of us who come from the traditional banking background, can the panel suggest some approaches to gaining competency in the fintech space? John?
I'd say, having done something like this at JP Morgan, where I was, it's setting up internal incubators and innovation disciplines makes sense. If you want to, what is it about fintech? You've got the finance and the big bank, what you don't have so much of the tech. You're trying to compete with the likes of Google and Facebook, who are draining the pool of the talent you need. So what you have to do is actually have a technical career path and celebrate it and build the disciplines around that and build the ecosystem around that. And I've seen that work very successfully at multiple large organizations, but it does require that it's a C-level construct. It does require that it's built into the DNA of the organization. It does require that it's taken seriously, because the smart people you want in these technology divisions will recognize if they're just being played. It'll take them a while, but they do recognize it. So I think it is possible, but definitely much harder than would have been 10 or 15 years ago, because you are really competing with the media companies, which is what Google and I think Facebook really are. And the FinTech startup had the exciting possibility of stock options, which larger firms won't really offer. So I think it can be done, but it has to be taken very seriously.
I think if I can add to that quickly, Michael, a lot of these big organizations don't tap into the resources they have. So particularly the big financial services institutions, the big corporates, they all pay into the high level apprenticeship scheme, which it should return them a pot of money for the training and development of staff. You've now got academic institutions. I mentioned Ulster University in Northern Ireland, but there are institutions all over UK and Europe who offer qualifications, including higher level apprenticeship qualifications in financial technology, which gave companies the opportunity to upskill their staff and develop capability in-house.
Folks, I never really need a watch because people start sending me thanks and good panel and a lot of compliments, which I'll send on to you. But briefly, just to close, think of any closing remark you'd like to make, but could each of you, for me, just address in order, where are we on the FinTech hype cycle? Kirk?
I think I'm over FinTech as a term and as a hype. I think it's divided into so many different areas. I think it mostly exists as a talking point for people that want to show really big numbers on graphs out of government agencies.
I'm going to answer the question. I think we're entering the trough. I think we've been at the peak. I think the COVID and the financing, the big shakeout where the investors want to see the returns is happening right now. And there is, of course, the journey towards the ramp up at the end of this, but I think we're entering the trough right now.
Okay.
I think it's too general to describe FinTechs as one on that hype cycle, Michael. I think, go back to what Kurt was saying a couple of minutes ago, I think the likes of blockchain is probably in the trough. I think there are other areas like e-payment facilitators, online payments, who are probably now in the productivity stage. So I think it very much depends on what type of FinTech business you are.
Yeah. And we've got a couple of other comments flowing in. Eric Masava is pointing out places like the Netherlands are looking at representing assets such as roads, big opportunities out there. Is that FinTech? Certainly finance is involved. Vladimir has come back to point out that disruptor FinTechs are probably not disrupting anything, as the new kids won't overtake the dinosaurs to sometime around 2050. So I think there's a lot to discuss here, but I kind of agree with you, Kirk. We're starting to see the fragmentation of this, and we're going to have to reform it in some way we can sensibly discuss it. But you guys have been absolutely super, an absolutely wonderful panel. If you give me just a second, I'd like to make 3 rounds of thanks. Firstly, to our sponsors, and Ian, glad to see you're here today. But yes, it's a real delight to have sponsors who will let us range so widely and freely. We genuinely appreciate it. I'd like to thank the audience. You've been particularly good today. Lots of good comments and questions. They will all be sent on to the panelists in a day or so with your relevant emails so they can get in touch if they wish. We do have a number of things coming up, an odd one on Monday, but an interesting one. As we're looking at going digital, some of the work that's going on the continent on digital signatures really needs a look at. And we've got a law firm from Poland educating us on digital signatures in Central and Eastern Europe. It is actually worth coming if you're going to do international business. A session on what banking actually stands for. A second in our series on what has the religions of the book got to teach us in finance. We had a brilliant session from the Islamic perspective, and this is going to be another one out of Northern Ireland with John McDowell. And then finally, innovation in the law on Thursday. So lots coming up. As ever, check out the website. But I must, most of all, thank our panelists. Thank you so much today. I was a little afraid that we might not get the conversation together, but that was no trouble. Kirk, thanks for dropping in despite the COVID, all those nicely distanced. I enjoyed that. Ian, those mountains of Mourne behind you, I do envy. I honestly do, really. And John, great to have you also. Normally, in a physical environment, we'd have the applause. I'm afraid I can't open the floodgates, so I have here my karmic Korean clapper from my Buddhist monastery in Bulgoksa, and I will thank you on behalf of the audience. And we hope to have you back again, because this is going to be a discussion that will run for some time. Thank you very much.